In the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Fernandez with the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation. On behalf of Arthur, his family, and the foundation, welcome to our Opportunity Zones Maximizing Impact in Atlanta Speaker Series event. We are happy to be co-hosting this event with our good partners, Central Atlanta Progress, and happy to be hearing from our superstar headliner, Bruce Katz, and our esteemed panelists that you will learn a little bit more about in a second. And we're excited about this topic for a variety of reasons as well. The mission of our foundation is to have a positive impact on people's lives that helps enhance and build the communities in which they live. And one way we try to do that is by seeking innovative solutions that help move forward change that folks don't think is possible today. And one of the things that is driving this, in addition to this looking at innovation, is some of the challenges that our communities are struggling with. You know, there are these two stats that stick out in my head, and I share with lots of people because they are, you know, what motivates a lot of the work we do as a foundation, what we do on the West Side, which are the city of Atlanta has some of the lowest economic mobility rates and highest income inequality of any major American city. Atlanta has a lot to be very, very proud of, but that's not one of them. And so, as a foundation, we believe we have a collective responsibility to marshal any tools or resources that we have to address that divide. And today's topic du jour, Opportunity Zones, is one powerful potential tool that can help us do that. I've had the benefit of spending the last day or so with Bruce and others really digging into this, and I think there's a lot of stuff, rich conversation to be had on Opportunity Zones, and you'll hear some really important themes around intentionality, around leadership, and around how this tool can be a great force for good in addressing some of the challenges that Atlanta and other cities across the country face, but if not executed with intentionality and leadership, has the potential to be a tool for evil, a tool that can help accelerate displacement, which is what you've been hearing and reading a lot about over the last few weeks. So we're all really excited to learn more about Opportunity Zones and think about their applicability to our community here in Atlanta. And with that, I'm going to stop because I want to get Bruce up here. I'm going to forego reading you his bio because it is in the program, as are the bios for all our panelists. And I think Bruce is someone, if you don't know anything about him, you should read up on him. He is a pretty well-accomplished scholar and a very nice guy. So with that, come on up, Bruce.
I almost forgot the clicker. That would have been a very short presentation. So I just want to thank Frank and Penny and AJ and John Baer for bringing a bunch of us here the last couple days. What myself and Ross Baird and John Lettieri and Kit will talk about is not your general presentation on a new federal tax incentive or new federal program where we got it all figured out, here's how you execute, blah, 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 right? I mean, we are basically building the plane while flying it. Ross, John, and myself in particular are part of like almost a traveling roadshow going around the United States and trying to understand what are different cities doing to maximize the economic and social impact of this new federal tax incentive, and also what's happening on the private side as capital's getting aggregated and different kind of funds are getting organized to focus on different kinds of projects and different kinds of zones. So, this is part of a learning exercise, right? And what I'm principally going to focus on is the city piece, how cities, not just governments, but public, private, civic, university, other leaders can really think intentionally and purposefully about this new tax incentive. And ensure that when we look back in 2 or 3 years, we begin to see some real social impact given where the zones have been designated. And then we'll have a panel, which I think we can for the tax advisors or wealth management firms or developers in the room, we'll get a lot of that focused on in the panel. So let me start. Maybe a month ago, we put out a paper out of Drexel in collaboration with Accelerator for America. If you've never heard of Accelerator for America, it's a new intermediary of cities, major financial institutions, pension funds, philanthropies, organized by Eric Garcetti, who's the mayor of Los Angeles. And so they've basically become the place for cities to go and learn about how to basically maximize this new tool. So we put out a paper which basically said, how do we move from transactions, because there's going to be a lot of transactions under this federal tax incentive, to transformation, right? And we built on a paper that we had written for Governor Hickenlooper and the National Governors Association several months ago. So if there's any people from the state in the room, the state had this role of designating the zones, but there's a whole bunch of stuff states could do, frankly. But this paper was really focused on cities and, to a lesser extent, counties. So I'm not going to go through the Opportunity Zone tax incentives, with great detail. I think there's a lot of people in the room already understanding what this is. But this is a very different kind of tax incentive. It's not like the low-income housing tax credit. It's not like the historic preservation tax credit, new market tax credit. Those are really policy tools that the federal government has used the tax code to attract equity for investments in particular purposes. This is a market tool. This is a different kind of tax incentive focusing on a different kind of audience. People, corporations with large capital gains who want to defer those capital gains, reduce those capital gains, and if they make investments in these zones, ultimately reap the benefit of those investments. Here's the general view that a growing group of city leaders, and again, when I use the word city, I'm not talking about governments, I'm talking about networks of leaders. If we're going to get the full economic and social impact of this, cities are going to have to act with intentionality and purpose. The market is going to do what the market wants to do, right? And when you think about the 8,700 census tracts that have been designated under this tax incentive, many of those are in places that actually already have an updrift of market momentum. There are a lot of deals to be already had, right? There were a lot of deals that were moving along, particularly, for example, in your central business district and other parts of your region. So the market's going to do what it's going to do, right? And because of the way this tax incentive is organized, we're not even going to know, really, unless the Treasury decides on certain reporting requirements, where opportunity fund equity is going, right? But cities have multiple roles to play because city governments have resources, they have powers, philanthropy, corporate, universities, hospitals, and others also have capital that can be deployed alongside market equity, right? So if we're going to do the kind of deals, the kind of projects, the kind of transactions that ultimately add up to transformation, we're going to have to find a blend of debt subsidy and equity and of public, private, and civic capital. And we're going to have to do that in a way where it's not just a bunch of one-offs. City X decided to do this, and City Y decided this, and City Z decided something else, right? It's got to be routinized so we can create a market and a new kind of capital stack and a new kind of way of designing, financing, and delivering transformative investments, right? So this is, in some ways, exciting, in some ways daunting. I used to be the chief of staff at the Department of Housing and Urban Development under Bill Clinton for Henry Cisneros, the former mayor of San Antonio. I guarantee you, if this tax incentive had been passed under Bill Clinton or either of the Bushes or Barack Obama, what basically people like me would have done in our prior lives would have been to organize conference calls all day long with constituencies, mayors, philanthropies, corporations, investors, to try to figure out how to create norms and models to maximize the impact. Right now, what we're getting out of Washington are some draft rules, but no real guidance. So the country's going to have to figure this out almost Wikipedia-like, right? And Atlanta's going to have to say, you know, we're going to be a first mover on Vine City, let's say, right, where we all visited yesterday. And we're going to do this in the following ways to get that neighborhood regenerated in an inclusive and sustainable way. And then 3 other cities will say, hey, did you hear what's going on in Atlanta? Wow, they got their shit together. Technical term, right? This is a really different kind of incentive. It's not a program. It's not a strategy. It's a tool. And we're just going to have to figure out, city to city, how to maximize it. So we put out 7 principles for city action. I'm not going to walk through this. You can get all this off of the Drexel website or Accelerator for America website, this Transactions of Transformation. The first thing I'll just say is principle number 1 is see the big picture, right? When we were in your central business district yesterday, and AJ took us around the Central Atlanta Progress, what you see in any American downtown, right, is the remnants, the vestiges of urban renewal from 60 years ago, right? Where they basically went in, tore down a bunch of stuff, built a bunch of parking lots, right? I mean, they just chopped up our cities, both at the granular level with buildings, and then, of course, the freeways, you know. And this tool could be our opportunity to repair the fabric of our downtowns and our greater downtowns. And in this city, you both have the central business district, but it extends out to Grady Hospital. So there's some really incredible assets you have in a relatively small geography. And if we can figure out the right kinds of investments, the market will do some of it, there'll be sort of blended finance on other things, we could revive the American downtown all over the United States. That provides an employment base, that provides a fiscal base, right, to invest back in people and communities. So there's a big picture here that's not just every transaction by transaction. It's really a big strategy for how to think about long-term regeneration. Cities are networks, not governments. I talked about that. Number 3, and as I get through the steps that cities could think about, one of the most important things that has to happen here are cities need to communicate their assets and advantages. We have a lot of capital being aggregated all over the United States. I think people know what Atlanta is. Maybe not with the granularity. I've been coming here for decades. I never knew you had a military fort in the middle of your city. I mean, you know, it was sort of hidden. I guess when the military was around, it was a secret, but fine. You know, so there's a lot of assets here that only you can articulate. You know, someone sitting at a desktop, you know, in Silicon Valley is not going to, you know, typing out, let me look at the data for Atlanta. They're not going to get the granularity of this place. So you have to identify the assets. You've got to balance rewards and controls, incentives and protections. There are very few guardrails on this tax incentive. Most federal programs come with a lot of prescriptions. This is a little bit of the Wild West, right? We're Americans, we get that. This is chaos, right? So you have to think about the principle of maybe not hyper-control, hyper-prescription, but rewards, incentives to get where you want to go. Partnerships are going to be key here. Partnerships across multiple sectors, partnerships across multiple jurisdictions, because this is a metropolis, not just a city, and a lot of zones were basically named in Fulton and DeKalb. If this is going to have social impact, it's not just about market investments. When we were in Vine City yesterday, we heard a lot about the Blank Foundation and other investments to upgrade the skills of local residents, to connect them to the jobs in the stadium, the convention center. This should be an opportunity, so to speak, we'll use the word opportunity way too much this morning, to think about skills of local residents and how they connect to good jobs, quality jobs in major anchor institutions. And the last piece, and this I'll come back to in the steps, it is really important that we use the Opportunity Zone Tax Incentive and Opportunity Funds, not just, again, to catalyze a lot of deals, but to think about, do we have the right institutions in urban America or metropolitan America now, in central business districts, in low-income neighborhoods, in university areas? Do we have institutions with the capacity, capital, and community standing to drive inclusive development and growth? I think the answer to that in most American cities is no. We have a lot of institutions. I mean, the Americans, we say we don't like government. We have lots of government, public authorities here, there, and everywhere. We have a lot of nonprofits, right, that have been given the remit around certain parts of our city, but they don't necessarily have the capacity or capital to do stuff at the scale that has to be done. So I'll come back to this in the steps, but the opportunity tax incentive is what we make of it. That's the basic conclusion that I'm going to provide today, and I think our panelists will provide as well. This is not your typical federal program, right? This is almost like a post-federal effort where the country needs to figure this out. Let's go through steps. I'm going to not read you this whole thing because I just want to focus on each of the steps. There's 10 because you have to be 10. If it's 12 steps, you feel like you're a recovering alcoholic, so I figured we'd stop at 10. Number one, a city needs an investment prospectus. So Mayor Garcetti basically sort of engaged myself and my late business partner, Jeremy Nowak, to design an investment prospectus for 5 cities. We did not do this in Los Angeles, even though he's the mayor of LA. We did this in Erie, Louisville, Oklahoma City, South Bend, and Stockton. 5 cities that this tax incentive was essentially created for, right? These are cities that are either have incredibly weak markets or moderate to middle growth markets. They're not Atlanta, right? But we invented the investment prospectus there. And what it basically does is help a city first set the economic context for the zones and the governance context for the zones. Each of these cities has designated someone in the private sector and someone in the public sector who are the go-to people on opportunity zones. So if you're an investor, you're a developer, and you're thinking about a project in a particular zone, you know who to call, right? Because a lot of times you're going to have to basically sort of obtain some kinds of public subsidy to make that deal work. So this is setting the economic and government context and then going into each of the zones, all right? Because most of these cities have multiple census tracts that were designated as opportunity zones. Census tracts are not markets, by the way. They're just administrative geographies. So in each of these cities, we had to work with the city and said, okay, you had 20 census tracts designated. What's the real, how many market areas are those? Sometimes 5, sometimes 7. And how do we describe what the assets of those different zones are? Assets, not deficits, right? This is not some kind of academic exercise. This is like, what is there to be invested in, what has been invested in, what could be invested in? So these prospectuses essentially try both to set the context for the city, for the zones, and then get as close as possible, as you possibly can get, and this is really with the help of Ross Baird, who will be on a panel, to investable projects, right? So if you want to Google Louisville, opportunity zone investment prospectus, take a look, because Atlanta needs this. It needs it for the city, and it needs it for the metro. Or else, you're not going to have any consensus on reality here. You're just going to have a lot of people talking about a lot of zones without any sense of how they differ from each other. One last thing about all the zones. 8,700 census tracts designated in the United States, right? This is not like empowerment zones, where basically the law said to designate 6 in the entire country. Ultimately, we designated 12. There's 8,700 census tracts that are eligible to receive tax advantage capital in this country. The only way to make any sense of this stuff is to start coming up with typologies of zones. Central business districts, hospital districts, university districts, industrial districts, airport districts, low-income neighborhoods. These are the sub-geographies of cities and counties. And so these prospectuses do that. They bring order out of chaos. Welcome to America, right? They bring order out of chaos. You really need to do this. Step 2, anchors. Grady Hospital is in a zone, right? Huge anchor here. the biggest publicly owned hospitals in the United States. So what does it mean for a hospital or a university to be in or near a zone? Georgia State, right? You got a lot of anchors in zones, and anchors do many, many things besides just employing a hell of a lot of people and providing a whole bunch of services. They own a lot of land, they own a lot of real estate, they have balance sheets, they have alumni networks. We're working with Notre Dame right now of creating an alumni fund to regenerate the downtown of South Bend. So even though anchor institutions, who are generally nonprofits in the United States, are not really eligible for these kind of tax incentives, they can play multiple roles as a platform for long-term sustainable inclusive growth. And most anchors in the US, I can guarantee you, still do not know that this federal tax incentive passed, because they're just looking at other stuff. You know, I mean, if it's not about us, we ain't paying attention. It is about them. And I think one of the things that has to happen here, and the picture up there is of a major site in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that's owned by a group of philanthropies near Carnegie Mellon, right? So, you know, it ain't that complicated what that large former steel site should be used for. It's basically for Carnegie Mellon to move off its campus, build a whole bunch of new research and other facilities. These kind of efforts can happen here, all right? But it means that there needs to be a network, again, a network of institutions and leaders that are beginning to sort out how each of these different stakeholders play a role. Number three, public assets. You know, the government in the United States, city, county, state, Port Authority, Airport Authority, Redevelopment Authority, Stadium Authority, Convention Center Authority, yada, 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 owns an incredible amount of real estate, right? In many cities, it's 25%, and I'm including right-of-ways along infrastructure. The government here owns an incredible amount of real estate. Unlike Northern Europe, no city really knows what it owns because it's all chopped up across all these different authorities and entities and general purpose governments. One of the most critical things to happen in opportunity zones is for cities, and this is already underway in Atlanta because the enterprise community folks are here and they've already been doing this in Seattle. They are beginning to unveil what does the public sector own. And once you understand what the public sector owns, much of which is around these zones, then you can figure out what's the value of that, and could individual parcels either be part of a deal, right? Workforce housing, right? So you can de-risk it, lower the cost, right? Or can there be a general disposition strategy with these public assets that could really enhance revenue flow over the long haul for city and public? So this is Newark, New Jersey. Newark, New Jersey woke up one day and found out that the state of New Jersey owned an incredible amount of stuff in the city, mostly schools that had already closed. They came up with a plan to basically reconfigure all this as teacher villages, right? Affordable housing for teachers, you can have affordable housing for medical workers, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is really smart stuff, but it means we have to understand what does the government own, what's the value of it, where is it, and how do you dispose of it. Obviously, the best model in the world is the Copenhagen City and Port Development Corporation. They took all the land along the harbor of Copenhagen and between the airport and the downtown. They put it under one publicly owned, privately driven corporation. They regenerated Copenhagen. It's now the third wealthiest city in the world. All the revenue from land sales and land leases then went to service the debt on a 21st century transit system. That's how the Danes do it. The Germans do it the same way. We're Americans. Welcome to chaos. So at a minimum, let's just figure out what the hell we own, and then let's figure out how to make some deals work. That would be a good day in America. So a fourth piece, and you know, a lot of this is about just weak market cities, central business districts, or neighborhoods that have been left behind. How do you create employment density and smart placemaking so that you could create business demand for private investment? I go to many parts of the United States, and again, we were working in Erie and South Bend. I mean, like, there hasn't been an investable deal in some of these downtowns at scale for a long period of time. you have to create business demand. So this will not be your central business district, which obviously has demand, but parts of your low-income neighborhoods, let's say, or parts of your counties. Demand is usually created, by co-location of assets, anchor institutions. I mean, think about why Phoenix is such an amazing city today. Well, Arizona State University moved into the downtown, right? Or Winston-Salem is such a powerful place. Well, Wake Forest and their medical center moved into the downtown, right? It's not a rocket science how you create demand, right? But you've got to co-locate assets in small geographies, and then that begins to radiate out. So this is actually a picture of Wake Forest Innovation Quarter in Winston-Salem. It's a remarkable story. So as you begin to think through your prospectus and think through these different kind of zones and different kind of zone typologies, some of them really don't have investable deals right now. But they could if you begin to aggregate demand in small geographies. Ross will talk about some work he's done in Louisville, in Shelby Park, that is completely relevant to the Vine City quarter here. And again, it's not a rocket science. It just has to be like executed well and with quality. Step 5 is infrastructure. We're not really sure, the extent to which traditional infrastructure will be financed through debt subsidy and equity through this tax incentive. But infrastructure clearly plays a major role because it's a platform, and I'm not just talking about roads and transit. I'm talking about broadband, I'm talking about water. That's a relevant topic here this morning. So there's multiple kinds of investments that can be made in cities alongside market investment, right, in a sort of a coordinated and aligned way. I do think in many parts of the country, and I think Ross, John, and I together may have been to 1,000 zones already. I mean, this is when you become way too obsessed about a new federal tax incentive, right? We are seeing industrial facilities, malls, dead malls all over the United States that basically are in zones, right? So when people think about that, right, the former Oscar Mayer facility in Madison, Wisconsin, or the Studebaker plant in South Bend, and we can go on and on and on. When you think about those large sites, it's not necessarily their prior use that really matters to today's economy. It's all the infrastructure that was built underneath this stuff. There's like more dark fiber in South Bend than in most parts of the US, right? So how do you begin to really use infrastructure as a platform, maybe not as a financing product as part of this tax incentive, but as a foundation for some smart growth? 6, align resources. Again, if transformation is going to happen, there are going to be a bunch of deals where the public sector has got to provide subsidy, right? And frankly, the philanthropic sector is going to have to provide some patient capital. This is not going to work for workforce housing, let's say, for the most part, in most markets, unless there are tax abatements or TIFs or zoning of some kind, right? There's a whole bunch of resources and powers that cities as networks and as governments have. The question is, how do you align those resources in some semi-intelligent way, right? I mean, not super intelligent, semi-intelligent, that's the bar, right? So that we can actually begin to get this stuff moving. For those involved in affordable housing, we all know that the low-income housing tax credit was devalued in the last tax bill because they cut corporate tax rates, and those were the folks who normally invested in this thing. So we've got to find a different financing model here, and that financing model's got to include some public subsidy. And various cities, including this one in various counties, going back to that public asset conversation, in addition to tax abatements, et cetera, there are multiple resources that could be brought to the table. So alignment, critical. Entrepreneurs. This tax incentive was not intended exclusively as a real estate deal, right? There's a lot of developers, I'm sure there's a lot of developers in the room. A man in full, Atlanta, we get it. You guys love real estate. This is about investing in operating businesses, right? And also investing increasingly in female-owned and minority-owned entrepreneurs, right? I mean, that's what this should be about. That was the intent of this legislation from Senator Booker and Senator Scott. So That's going to require, first of all, we got to get some federal rulemaking that makes some sense. John's in charge of that. He can talk about that. But we also have to set up centers, intermediaries, places where entrepreneurial wannabes can go and really begin to understand how to make this work. So there's a bunch of these around the U.S. I mean, this is one in Youngstown, Ohio. There's a great one in Philadelphia, the Enterprise Center. Atlanta needs this, right? I mean, we just can't expect everyone just to figure it out on their own. So we need mentoring, we need legal assistance, we need accounting, all the stuff that we need. I could use it. I just started a business, but I may come down here and get some advice. But helping entrepreneurs has got to be a critical piece of this. Work skills, I mentioned this before. The federal tax incentive says nothing about skills or schools, right? Nothing. But if you want to have social impact, the most immediate way you can have social impact is by upgrading the education and skills of disadvantaged people. I mean, proven again and again and again and again. You've got efforts here in Vine City which show some promise, can be amplified, can be expanded. You have efforts in Philadelphia and other parts of the U.S. that are best in class. So this is again, it's an opportunity for private, corporate, university, hospital leaders, the anchors with large amounts of jobs, but also large amounts of capital to deploy to create these kind of skills intermediaries. This is a way to have these parallel efforts moving. Market investment, and then social investment around schools and skills in a targeted strategic way. The opportunity zones focus the mind, right? They are real places, they are real geographies. They are either very close, even cycling distance to many of your anchor institutions, or a MARTA ride away, right? We should really take advantage of this. And then there are obviously other other inclusive efforts that we could do as well. That's affordable housing, right? And affordable housing, not just on the rental side, but on the ownership side. There's a great report out of Brookings, my former life, last week about the suppression of black wealth in the United States because of the way in which structural racism affected value appreciation in homes. So if you're a black homeowner in the U.S., they calculated there's probably $156 billion that has been lost because of the way in which we've segregated people in the United States. So affordable housing on the rental side, access to home ownership, access to ownership of commercial real estate for businesses. We've got to think about how this, again, this tax incentive can begin to undo a bunch of the structural racism issues that we've been dealing with for so long. Last piece, institutional transformation. No one ever talks about this in the US. We just accept whatever institutions we've built and just say, well, that's the way it's always been, that's the way it always will be, right? In 1958, just to give you an example, sort of in the height of urban renewal in the 50s, Philadelphia created the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation because they knew that if they left it to every other entity in Philadelphia to basically execute urban renewal, a lot of people would go to jail. This is Philadelphia. So there's, in Philadelphia, we don't talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. We call about the good, the bad, and the indictable. And usually we switch it, the indictable, and then the bad, and then the good. But they created an institution in 1958, it's now 60 years old, to basically design and execute urban renewal. About, I think there's 17 members of the board, 9 members of the board are appointed by the chamber, and 8 members by the mayor. So it's private-public, right? It's not public-private in many respects. This institution, 60 years later, has invested billions all over Philadelphia. They transformed the Navy Yard, when the military gave it back to them, into a real vibrant business district. It's now becoming mixed use. It is a functioning institution with capacity, capital, and community standing, right? The three C's. I think this tax incentive, again, even though it was never intended to remake, repurpose, build new institutions that actually can get stuff done, If we're smart about this, not in a ubiquitous way, but zone by zone perhaps, we should think about whether we have the right institutions that can actually carry out inclusive and sustainable development at scale, so that when we look back at a Vine City, for example, right, in 3 or 5 or 7 years, we can say, wow, that really was transformative. This is not going to happen through just a bunch of transactions. It has to happen with some kind of intelligent design and smart and capable execution. So what we've been working on in various other cities is how do we create these new kinds of 21st century institutions? Erie, Pennsylvania, again, I mean, just a place, 100,000 in the city, 350,000 in the county. They created the Erie Downtown Development Corporation. This is even before Opportunity Zones. They modeled it on the Cincinnati Over the Rhine Corporation, which has been highly successful in Cincinnati. Erie Insurance put $30 million into this development corporation. They are now acquiring strategically properties in Erie's downtown and moving towards that co-location of assets that I talked about before. Erie has a shot, right? Because they've basically built an institution, built for purpose, that is now able to sort of move strategically in their central business district. They're going to unlock local capital and attract national capital to basically get this done. So I guarantee you there is some institutional move that has to be made in Atlanta. You can't do everything, but you should try to figure out, well, where that's going to be and for what purpose. Every city in the US has got to think about this. We've inherited mid to late 20th century institutions. You know, I mean, my favorite poster child for idiocy is the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, right? Wealthiest city in the world. Wealthiest city in the world from a real estate perspective, right? Has a $110 billion deficit in its transit system. And it can't figure out a way to unlock the value of its public assets. So like Copenhagen or like Hamburg or Helsinki or Stockholm, as the real estate rises, the public sector is getting some kind of revenue flow to service the debt on next generation infrastructure. So we'll maybe never get to that kind of public asset corporation, but there's a whole bunch of other institutions that we can build here. Last piece is organized for success. Here's Erie again. I'm Erie obsessed. Everyone who has a pulse in Erie is involved in the Opportunity Zone Initiative. I mean, I went to Erie, you know, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks ago, sat around a table with about 35, 40 people from all these different institutions, and it was true collaboration to compete. I mean, true collaborating to compete. They know this is their shot. Now, Erie's got a crisis because it hasn't, you know, GE Transport left. Any industrial facility that wanted to get out, got out, right? So they're left with eds, meds, and a bunch of small, medium-sized enterprises, all of whom are completely obsessed with the city. I mean, it's a beautiful city. It's right on Lake Erie, hence Erie. But, you know, they actually do need to get their act together now. And so they're sitting together as a group of stakeholders, basically saying, okay, if you do this, I'll do this. We can make that move over here. Oh, wait, the state's doing something. Oh, we just heard that Toronto wants to, you know, invest out of some funds into the U.S. I mean, these folks are sharing and moving together. Now, it's a small place, so you could just say, well, the small places have an advantage for this. Trust me, on these zones are small places. So don't think about your city or metro in the aggregate, you know, because it's too big. Think about these zones. Who has a stake in these places? They can come to the table and they begin to work together, perhaps through some new institutional structures, to make this work. So, you know, those are the 10 steps, so to speak, for how a city, not as a government, but as a network, could potentially maximize what is a federal tax incentive and was basically intended to set off the animal instincts in the United States, which it has done, right? I mean, you know, we're Americans, we get this. You know, I mean, there's nothing like a federal tax incentive that gets like large numbers of people in the US going completely bonkers, right? I mean, tax advisors, wealth management companies, these are American jobs, right? So they're all completely obsessed with this stuff. But from our perspective, If this is going to work for people and places, disadvantaged people and places, which is the whole purpose of this thing to begin with, we're going to have to get a hell of a lot more intentional and purposeful in our cities, in our counties, right? Maybe with the help of our states. You never know. The feds, at this point, their only job from their perspective is probably at 12 midnight on a Tuesday, throw some rules over the transom, and then say to everyone, figure it out, They don't have the capacity to basically do anything except write a bunch of rules. So it's up to us, is really the bottom line. So with that, I'm going to introduce our panel so we can start talking about this. Ross Baird, president of Village Capital, has lived in Atlanta for a long time and is heavily involved in Vine City, but also low-income communities around the country, around small business development and growth. Really important stuff to talk about. John Lettieri, one of the godfathers of this new federal tax incentive with the Economic Innovation Group, which is a new, really do tank, located in Washington, D.C. He can talk about who's backed this and how this tax incentive came to be. And then Kit King from SunTrust Community Capital, president, who's actually already made some opportunity zone investments. So he can talk about what that was like, but also about the bank and its perspective on this new incentive. So thank you very much. Now we'll talk about the panel. So I'm actually going to skip Ross for a second and just ask John to describe what the hell were you thinking about here? No, because this incentive really comes out of deep research you were doing about spatial inequities in growth in the United States and how this kind of market tool could begin to remedy some of that. And this is spatial inequities both across the country and within cities and metropolitan areas. So I thought you might just give the audience a sense of the origins of this.
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks to the Blank Family Foundation and CAP for putting this on. So, as Bruce alluded to, my organization was involved in helping policymakers in the House and Senate on a bipartisan basis address what has emerged in the wake of the recession as one of the big challenges we're facing nationally. And I want to distinguish from the ever-present challenge of spatial inequity that we've always had. We've always had some places doing better than others. We've always had deep centers of poverty and a lack of opportunity in this country. What's new, and what's new in scale and dimension in terms of the challenge we're facing today, is coming out of the recession, the growth of new jobs and new businesses doesn't map to where they were lost in the recession. So you have this highly concentrated, geographically concentrated recovery that has bypassed many places that have long been in need and many places that prior to the recession were unstable, but keeping their head above water. And this has knocked them off of their axis. And what we have in the wake of the recession is, just to throw one data point at you, the top 20% of zip codes around this country have generated more net new jobs, more net new businesses, more population growth, more advanced degree holders, more new immigrants than the bottom 80% of the country combined. And it's not even close, by the way. That puts into crystal clear terms the type of challenge we're facing as a country, where growth is aggregating in a select few places, many of them superstar cities, many of them highly prosperous parts of cities, and it's bypassing a lot of others. And one common challenge, because you're covering a lot of geography here, they're all different, but they all need good human capital. So to Bruce's point about investing in skills and investing in education, they all need investment capital. They all need the capital to grow businesses, to redevelop their built environments. And so this Opportunity Zones policy is the first federal attempt in response to those growing challenges on the spatial inequality basis to open up a channel for capital to connect with communities that have not been connected before. And it's worth unwinding that a little bit. One of the bright spots, if you're a capitalist of the recovery, is that there's been a record surge in capital gains holdings. So if you're an investor in the wake of the recession, you're likely doing very well. So as of the end of 2017, just in stocks and mutual funds alone, U.S. investors, individual and corporate, had about $6 trillion in capital gains wealth. That is capital that never makes its way to communities that are disconnected from the capital markets. It just doesn't happen. And so the idea here was, how do you use successful investments from other parts of the economy to pay for that capital connection that communities need? How do you do that? And that's what this is an attempt to do. Imperfect, as Bruce noted. There are things about this that are features. There are things about this that are bugs. Some of the things that feel like bugs are actually features. I would say the lack of central planning around this is ultimately going to be one of its great features. It's going to put an onus on communities to develop solutions from the ground up that will bring, and already is bringing, I would argue, you look at the Erie example, a type of buy-in that they have never seen before in terms of civic engagement, public and private sector, philanthropies coming alongside those investors to come up with solutions that are uniquely right-sized for those communities, not implemented from afar and pushed down. But in the meantime, that same versatility that I see as a feature is a huge challenge, right, to get up and running in community by community around the country. But Bruce, to your specific question, what were we thinking? So the research was informing this, the sense that Republicans and Democrats, rural to urban, everything in between, were hearing this from their communities before they were seeing it in the data, by the way. That even as this national recovery looked good, those national stats did not reflect local reality for tens of millions of Americans, and simply do not reflect reality for tens of millions of Americans. So the political incentive was to declare victory and say, oh, recession's behind us, the recovery's in full swing, we're good. GDP's growing again, case closed. But the distribution of that growth is so profoundly uneven, and members were hearing about this from their constituents, they just didn't see it in the data yet. So once they started to see it in the data, they were putting anecdote with data together and said, look, we need a new toolkit, because this challenges our notion for what type of policy tools, especially at the federal level, are adequate for addressing that kind of distributional challenge that we're seeing today.
So one thing I'd recommend to everyone in the audience is, what's your website? Just
eig.org.
Yeah, I would spend a little bit of time on this website, because this research on spatial disparity in the United States, we've seen it before, but this is path-breaking stuff. And again, to have that as the foundation or infrastructure for this tax incentive shows intentionality and purpose from what is a relatively new, you're like a startup. How long have you been around?
3 years.
So only in America, right? This is great. This is probably one of the most profound tools for urban regeneration we've seen really in the history of the modern policymaking, and it came from an institution that's 3 years old. So spend some time on that website. Ross, I want you to describe what your firm does, because I think it's really quite unique and quite distinctive. And then, as this opportunity zone incentive was being formulated, why you thought what you do might be impacted by it, or you might be able to leverage your networks and your experience to actually make this work.
Great. Well, thanks, Bruce, and thanks to CAP and thanks to the Blank Foundation for hosting this really important conversation. So how I got here about 10 years ago, I co-founded, with the help of a lot of people in this room, a group called Village Capital, and we started investing in entrepreneurs that were having a positive impact on their communities, positive impact on the world. We started right here in Atlanta, and one of the things that became very obvious is if you look at where capital flows, so John mentioned the generational decline in entrepreneurship. It's surprising to me when I read the EIG data that entrepreneurial activity is actually at a 40-year low. If you look at the media or you look at this great initiative, the narrative would be different. But if you look at where capital goes, it doesn't really reflect where America is. So most people who raise capital successfully look like the people sitting up on this stage. Most people who live in opportunity zones do not look like the people who live on this stage. There's a big gap. Most people who make decisions over where capital goes do look like the people who are sitting on this stage. There's a big translational problem in capitalism between who has money and power and control over capital and who ends up being able to access it. So there are a number of reasons why we started Village Capital, but one of the emerging things we've discovered is being able to change where capital flows completely can change the direction of a portfolio, a city, and economy. So today, about 80% of startup investment goes to 3 states, New York, Massachusetts, California. 2% of startup investment in 2016 went to women. 1% of startup investment in 2016 went to people of color. And so 1% went to rural areas. So large demographics, large geographies are completely out of the conversation. We, over the last decade, have invested in about 100 companies across the country, and it's a very different portfolio. It's about 90% are outside the 3 big states where capital goes, including we've made more investments in Atlanta than any other city. About 40% of our investments are in women. About 30% of our investments are in people of color. And if you look at this portfolio, which is much more diverse, it's kind of asset management 101. More diversified portfolios outperform. It's outperforming comparable venture funds. And so one of the things that got me excited about the opportunity zone legislation is creating an incentive for people to think differently about where capital goes and who has the ability to access capital is really necessary nationally. So I got to know EIG early on in the process and have been part of the Opportunity Zone Coalition. And one of the things we've been looking at, and I can probably talk more in detail is in a follow-up, one of the things we've been looking at is not just what does this mean at a 100,000 foot level, but what does this mean at a street corner level? What does this mean at a neighborhood level? What are ideas, products, prototypes that can actually get people who are not accessing capital today access to the capital they need to grow?
So we're going to come back to Ross because, and he mentioned it right now, if you're trying to make a market in a Wikipedia-like way, from city to city, from constituency to constituency, what you need, yeah, you do need some rules. We can come back to the rules. But we need some norms, some models, some prototypes. And one of the things Village Capital has been working on in Louisville and other cities is essentially a prototype that could have dramatic effect for Vine City and other low-income neighborhoods all over the country. So we'll come back to that. Kit, this is the general part of the Q&A. So major bank, I'm a customer, thank you. I mean, we don't really think about the large commercial banks sort of engaged on this tax incentive because, generally speaking, when it came to community development, you have a community development division, Community Reinvestment Act kind of division. But how has your bank thought about in general about what this tax incentive means for what is a very broad catchment area? And what have you begun to do to organize yourselves to take advantage of it?
And thank you, Bruce. And just very quickly, thank you to the Blank Foundation and to CAP as well for hosting this conversation. I think this is very, very timely. And the first thing I would say is, why did this not happen in December of 2017? It would have saved me a lot of heartburn over at SunTrust because we did put a fund together, and I'll share a little bit more about that. But I wish I'd met these 3 very intelligent, handsome guys 12 months ago. That's why they put me up here. I'm the banker. You got to have the 3 smart guys, and you throw the banker up here. So we didn't know anything about this program. I was sharing this with them last night at the dinner. Flashback 12 months ago, we were very focused on what was happening with tax reform. And as Bruce shared, I run our community capital group. So we do all of the tax credit investing on behalf of SunTrust. So we were very focused on how will tax reform impact the core business that we're in, low-income housing tax credit business, the new markets tax credit business, historic credits, those types of things. And this whole Opportunity Zone program, if you will, that John and others worked so hard to get done, we didn't even know anything about it. Well, the first time I probably heard anything about it at the bank was maybe in March when we had an attorney do a presentation, wanted to kind of break down some of the benefits from the Tax Reform Act, and they said, hey, by the way, number 5, to kind of use Bruce's list, number 5, they threw out this thing called Opportunity Zones. So the first answer to your question is we gave no thought to it. We knew nothing about it until probably early spring. About a month or 2 later, the next big phone call I got was from our tax department, and our tax department said, hey, by the way, we have a capital gain from December of 2017. We'd like to see whether or not we can take that gain and deploy that using the Opportunity Zone program. And so I had to kind of dig back out my notes and go, I think I've heard about this somewhere. I need to go, see who was it that was telling us about this. And as Bruce said, I mean, it would be unusual for banks to be your typical investor in this space, and that's because banks don't drive a lot of capital gains. That's not to say that we can't. We certainly did at SunTrust, and I know some of the other banks have done that, but typically most of the gains that we drive that might be capital gains for other investors are categorized as ordinary gains for banks. So we're not going to be your typical investor, and yet we are a huge investor class that's very involved in this type of community development investments that investing that is going on. And so there's a great fit for banks to know about this and figure out what our role is, but it's challenging sometimes as we think of ourselves as an investor to see that may not be the most natural place for us to fit in. So we have we put a fund together. We were able to put our dollars out. We put our dollars out into 6 affordable housing properties. So we had sort of a focus on something that we knew well. But again, even in the last 24 hours, hearing from these guys and going around on the tour yesterday in Atlanta, I think, could we do it all over again, we probably would have decided to strategize differently from the way we did. We just didn't have a lot of time. We booked the gain, and you have 180 days to invest that, and then you have 180 days once you invested in the fund to deploy those dollars. And so we were under the gun. So I sort of envy many of you in the room. If you're thinking about this more as an investor, you have a little bit more time to be strategic. So I think I wish we had been more strategic. But, where is our role today? Notwithstanding maybe future gains, I mean, I think our role is obviously to come alongside a lot of you and provide project finance for, deals that make sense. And I think hopefully most of the banks will do that. I think we have a good feel for what's going on in a lot of these communities. I saw John Amon here earlier. We're very engaged with what's going on the west side here in Atlanta and hope to be an investor in the real estate fund there. So there's some things that we can do to try to shepherd projects through and provide project finance. Perhaps there are some things that we can do to find a way to educate other investors. We obviously, on the banking side, we have a lot of private wealth clients, and so there's a way potentially for us to be a clearinghouse for that, to be able to share, this is what this program is, here's where we think it may benefit you, and maybe there's we talked a little bit about sort of the syndication of deals. How do we get, people with dollars to shovel-ready projects? So potentially we can play a role there. So and perhaps other things. So I'm here listening as much as everyone out in the audience as well. I mean, we don't have any hard and fast ideas at this point. We're still trying to figure it out ourselves.
So John, I thought maybe before we talk about Atlanta in specific, you could just sort of table set for the audience. Given this tax incentive, what did you intend for investors to invest in? And obviously, right now, we're still going through some rulemaking at the federal level. But what's been surprising to me, and we talked a little about it last night as we go around the country, is there was sort of a group of investments that I think were generally thought of as the potential investments from this tax incentive, real estate, et cetera, small business, entrepreneurial activity. But now there's all this interest in childcare and school buildings and public housing, and it's just been an energy. It's just been a remarkable flourishing of thinking about new kinds of financing for a broad array of investments. So what was the original intent and the general rules around it? And then what do you see happening as we move forward?
It's a great question. Congress intended versatility to this tool. It recognized one thing in particular, which is that the needs and opportunities in Atlanta are going to look very different than those in small towns in Vermont or in the southwest of the country. From community to community, it's different. And so you need a tool. If you want to do a couple of things. One is if you acknowledge that the scale of the challenge is much bigger than the tools we're bringing to the fight and the resources we're bringing to the fight. And by the way, tax reform was a step back for community investment tools generally. You look at LIHTC, the value of LIHTC diminishes. There was real talk about eliminating New Markets Tax Credit, although that didn't happen. CDFI fund consistently gets zeroed out in federal budgeting. So this is an environment in which the general norm has been recession of resources applied to this challenge, not increase. So Opportunity Zones runs counter to that in a very positive way. But the acknowledgement from Congress as a premise was, if you want to dramatically increase the scale of resources we're bringing to this, you have to have a tool that's versatile enough to be relevant in a rural community and in an urban community, in the Southeast as well as the Northwest, and everything in between. And to do that, you need to set parameters, which they've done in the law. You need additional rules of the road, which they're hopefully going to do with Treasury rulemaking, although that's shaving a few years off of my life expectancy. And you need to allow local innovation to apply the tool to local needs and challenges. So what are some examples of that? If you think about what Opportunity Zones funding can be used for, there are a few buckets to put it in. One is its equity. This is equity finance, not debt finance. There are other tools that are very helpful on the debt finance side, and there's a lot of market around debt financing. Equity is a big gap in a lot of these communities. That's what this is intended to fill first and foremost. Two, you can do a few categorical things with opportunity funding. One is the built environment. So you can do new housing, new commercial development, new mixed use, or you can purchase existing property as long as you substantially improve it. And the bill sets a very high bar for what qualifies. So what you can't do, for example, would be to buy an affordable housing unit, flip the rents up to market rate overnight, and call it a day. How does the bill avoid that? It says if you're going to buy an existing property, a property existing in use, 100% of the basis value has to be invested after your acquisition. So if you buy something for $100,000, you're putting $100,000 of additional investment into it. This is particularly important to avoid some bad outcomes, but also to drive towards some very good outcomes. A lot of these communities, we look across the country, vacancy and underused assets are a common phenomenon across the board. You see tons and tons, and Bruce, you alluded to this, of underused or completely blighted assets that are off the tax roll. They're serving no community purpose. They're not invigorating the tax base of the community. But there's something there to be done with them, right? So this is encouraging investors to spend their resources on those assets. It's going to give them a tax advantage, but it's going to cost them not just the acquisition cost, but you have to do something with it. So you can't just buy and hold an asset, in other words. That's one category. The other category that gets much less attention, but is far more important, is the operating business side. You can take an equity stake in a business, either through original issue stock or a partnership interest, and it skews towards new business formation or small and medium-sized businesses that are poised to grow. So this is growth capital, either to establish new businesses, and again, Ross reiterated this, we have an entrepreneurship crisis in this country. We are at 40-year lows of new business formation rates. That crisis is most acute in low-income communities, have been hit the hardest by a lack of entrepreneurship, and if you believe, as we all do, that the map of access to capital for entrepreneurs does not reflect the map of talent or great ideas or potential marketplaces to build businesses, then we should all be doing something about that. This is an opportunity. Given where these communities have been designated, you've got a lot of entrepreneurs who never had access or have not had adequate access to the capital markets, to equity investors, who now hopefully will have a connection as this thing matures. So that category is really important. It's also the area, when it comes to the rulemaking, that's the most undeveloped, let's put it, in terms of where the focus has been. So we are pushing very hard, and I've said publicly in testimony, if this becomes a real estate incentive in practice, if that's the ceiling, not the floor, that's a failure. And I know that congressionally, that's what the sponsors would say as well. If this becomes, at the floor, a way to redevelop the built environment, and at the ceiling, a way to